Well, thank you very much indeed. That was very, very interesting. And I think hopefully it's alleviated a few wee spooky thoughts in people's heads about what they're all about. What we're going to do now is we're going to actually introduce you to a couple of these very vicious wee United Irishmen. Some of whom you may recognise.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have been honoured with the task to show you maybe what some of the Irish rebellion at that time would have looked like with United Irishmen. And we're more from the Ulster side of things. And the Ulster men at that time would have turned out in their Sunday best. So we're trying to represent that along with the basic weapons. It wasn't an organised army, as I'm sure you've heard. It was a bunch of farmers, shopkeepers, greengrocers, stage men, stagecoach drivers, the whole lot, just whoever they could gather up at the time and who had allegiance to the whole thing. So you'll see sort of a couple of the weapons that was mostly used by the insurgents more than the armies, because they didn't have armies. They hadn't a lot of muskets unless you were Lord of the Manor or somewhere along them lines. So because it was a secret society for a long time, a lot of things was hidden in the thatch, a lot of things was disguised as other tools. So as when the redcoats or the militia come along to search the property, you didn't give yourself away too much. They probably knew rightly what you were up to, but if you had a valid excuse for what you had, well, they couldn't take it off you or arrest you. So these are sort of two of the weapons that they had. This weapon here, which they made bigger versions going on to this, and probably most common that you see in the pictures was the bill hook with the spike in the top. But this here was used weapon as it turned into, but it was more a farming implement and was known to come from the Vikings right through to even modern times today. And some of you might say it's a boat gaff. But it was used, a gaff would be the right word for it, because if you were poaching the local lord's rivers for salmon or that, you could turn it upside down and go in and use it to hook the odd fish upwards. You also could use it for raiding his orchard, whereby you could reach up on the branches down and pick the apples. And then you had the spear on it for maybe getting the odd rat or two within the corn sheafs. It also was used for lifting slack out of the dams. It had this was a real multi-purpose tool. But also in the right hands, it was a very dangerous weapon, as you can imagine. They sharpened this hook up, and it was a great weapon for even back in Viking times and medieval times and all. That was kept razor sharp, and that was to cut the reins of the horses. So if a horse was galloping by, you didn't want to kill the horse or whatever. You needed him for, you might be lucky enough to capture it, and it could be your mount for the battle. So you didn't want to destroy horses or hurt horses if you could possibly do it. But the way to take the man off the field was you cut the reins, and it got slapped in the ass, he disappeared into the sunset. So it helped two ways, as in it took a man off the field and you saved a horse, supposedly. As I say, the spike then could be used for stabbing. It also was a good weapon for if there was a line of men coming at you, piking at you, could reach over and grab them by the shoulder or by the neck, or reach underneath and catch them in the back of the knee and cut the tendons in the back of the knee. So you could disable men lovely with that. So that was just left lying about the farmyard. Real good tool for the job. Not much good against, I suppose, musketry and that, which a lot of the militias and that had. But if you charged quick enough, you could get in there before they reloaded, and it could be used greatly. This man here was sort of the local stagecoach guard, so he was lucky enough that the stagecoach company gave him a blunderbuss. So he was able to bring a blunderbuss with him onto the field. But he also would have carried something else, because once he discharged that was nearly him. You were maybe in hand-to-hand battle, or if he was in an action where he could constantly use it, it was good. Real good weapon of the day, as in he just filled it with stones or pebbles or ledge balls or whatever he had made up the night before. But he didn't want to get caught carrying too much, so he probably would have carried like marbles or something with him in a wee bag, so they couldn't argue with him at the time if caught. And he was a legitimate man, as he was the guard in the stagecoach or whatever at the time. And obviously at close range that could do a lot of damage and take a lot of people out. So if he kept his uniform on, which he has, and his livery, he could get away with it. Next man up's the farmer, and he's got his billhook, and that was used for slashing hedges. Now he's exaggerated a wee bit and put a longer shaft on it, but he had to reach up higher to trim those large hedges. So that's why he got it. The shaft probably would have been no longer, if not shorter, than this. And billhooks, just the same billhook as you go down to the local hardware shop and buy today. Farmers still use them. And there again, coming from medieval times, nothing special about it, that's just what it was. Some of them went to the local blacksmiths and got the additional spike put on it, and this is probably more the one you would see in a lot of the pictures and that, of a typical main weapon of the United Irishmen. And the blacksmith was able to forge weld a spike coming on out from here. Now how you explain that when the militia called around was a bit harder, so they would have hid that weapon more so. Maybe had a standard weapon like this, and then hid the other in the thatch or out in the fields buried somewhere. When the time come for the call, they went out and reshafted it and used it. Also effective against horse, because they could have dropped it down like a pike, so they're able to keep people at a distance. But there again, hand-to-hand fighting. The armies at this time and the rebels at this time were very, very poorly armed, because there was a tightening up of gunpowder, there was a tightening up of weapons that was available. So unless you had a scattergun in this, or your grandfather had one from the Napoleonic Wars or something, and had kept it and used it for shooting rabbits or something, you generally weren't well armed. So it was really so some could still say it today, just to gather in the masses and taking up with what they could grab going out the kitchen door or out of the farmyard. Dress-wise, we had progressed from last week. You've seen that we had here last week. The 1690 rose into 1740, 1750s. They had progressed a little bit more. They were more into fancier trousers, the longer boots, shoes with buckles. They'd removed the ribbons from their breeks and had buttoned them, just a bit more fancier for that stage. Hat gear, just whatever you had. Still like the old hat for the rain and for working and that sort of thing, and keeping the sun out of your eyes because they didn't have sunglasses and different things like that. Keep the dust down and all sorts of things. So there's practicalities behind the hats. They still light them up for sort of clear vision, and especially if you were slashing and working in the fields, you kept this side up so as you could work your tools and different bits and bobs. Tricorns were very, very popular within the townspeople, and the townspeople generally dressed that little bit better, which I suppose I'm trying to represent. Would have had a musket, a small pistol, a lot smaller than the one I had with me last week, which was this size, more dragoons, just more or less a protection for if you're out in the streets and going home at night. You always had something in case the street vagabonds was out trying to rob you on your way home. You had a little bit of protection as a gentleman. You maybe would have had a swag stick with a sword in it, which you still would have carried. You could have carried your sword legitimately, and own a sword legitimately, being the hierarchy. A bit more fancier lace. Although I've got a red coat on, I could have defected from the militia into the armies, and the thing about it was red coats was seen to be the red coats no matter through time. A red coat coming over the hill only meant one thing: trouble. And there's a story told up and around the Garva part where a lady had got her father many years ago had brought home she kept his old red coat from the army, and she was out feeding the chickens, and the United Irishmen were out doing a wee bit of practice on the hill, and the scouts seen this red coat coming and they all dispersed, but it was the lady with the red coat. So maybe red going along with this maybe isn't really what you'd want to be seen wearing, because you could be mistaken for the wrong person. But it was just to give you an idea of the cut and the jib. McCracken and them had green coats and can still be seen in the museum in Belfast. Some of them had this with zips or button flies had come in at this time, and a lot of them were the fold down flaps. But as time progressed, they sort of lost, and you had more of the button front, which still carried through from the early 1700s right through. So you get a wee bit of mix and match. Just as time went on, things changed and become more fashionable. And they turned the kings and the queens for fashion at this time, as up until this stage it was just whoever come out fancy dressed, and you fancied it. And coming out of Europe and different parts of Europe, they adapted it. And in Ireland, they were very, very fashion conscious. You know, right from 1300s right through, the Irish liked their fashion, and when a new fashion appeared from Europe, they all wanted it, and they were trading. And that time they were trading wool heavily and their grains heavily, and all their fish from Donegal and that. So there was always plenty of trading going on across Europe. So a bit of barter went on. We'll bring us some of that material, and the ladies would have been quite skilled here, and the men would have been quite skilled to fashion if they got a bit of kit at all. And you've got to remember at that time there's roughly about 25,000 men going out of Ireland every year to fight in European wars, wherever it may be. And of course some of them made it home. So when they come home, they were coming home in the latest dress. So it was a matter of copying it. And there's a girl in America studying clothes, and she's actually one that produces a lot of the patterns now for us. Lucky enough, reenactors don't have to go do all that research. And a nice email to Kay in America, and she'll tell you exactly what's right and what's wrong and what button was used. And we're looking through the archaeological digs and all sorts of things, which is expanding every day, as you know. There's finds every day. So we're lucky from this period. There's quite a lot of paintings and descriptions and all, so we can portray it quite accurately. The United Irishmen, as regards the game that we are involved in, and John here, I think, was at one quite recently there, is now becoming more reenacted, and so there's more interest in the detail of how we turned out, etc., etc. The militia were well armed. They would have had cannon and all sorts of things, but they also were able to uproot a few cannon on the United Irishmen side as well. So you had cannon crews trained, and there were hidden churches, and there were hidden vaults, and they were hid all over the place. So there was certain men was reasonably well trained in what they done and how they took action. And especially if you read about the Battle of Antrim, they had a couple of cannon up at Church Street, and they were getting there, and they actually had the thing won. I'm sure you all know the story. And the cavalry, the horse militia come flying in, and they got beaten back and were run out. And then the boys in Rambles, come from Rammelstown, thought they were coming to attack them, that the whole thing won. And as a matter of fact, one more wee push and they had it. But it didn't happen. It's like all battles. There was always that wee if only. It just turns the whole tide of the whole thing. But as I say, there's nothing special. A few muskets, which I'm sure you've seen if you were here last week, went through them, flintlocks, and then they were more into the precision cap. But most of them have been flintlocks, old flintlocks, brought out onto the field, especially from the United Irishmen side of things. And as I say, they were mostly Presbyterians in the north that came out to fight. There's very few of the native Irish or the Catholic faith fought in Ulster, and the United Irishmen or come into that. And I'm sure you've heard the intricacies of it was push and shove, and it was who was trying to outdo and who was going to gain the most out of it, and the underlying current that was within that movement at the time. So I don't really have a big lot more to say about the whole thing. Miss Andrew can add a few more bits and bobs.
Well, I think you've fairly well covered it. And I think it was the hanging judge himself, Buddy Hutchison from Ballymoney, who said it was as well the Presbyterians turned out in their Sunday best because they looked their best when they stepped off the pleasure step, which was the hangman's step. And of course, Bloody Hutchison made his name by hanging Presbyterians, whether they took part in the rebellion or not. If you were spotted on the street, he would summarily execute you if you were a Presbyterian. And The irony is that 2 Presbyterians were hung from the clock tower in Ballymoney, 2 rebels of the time, and they were just buried where they fell, below the clock tower. And of course Hutchison was buried in a great grand grave up in the old graveyard in Ballymoney. But when they were renovating the streets, they came across the bodies of the 2 men. And of course the neighbours of bloody Hutchison in the cemetery are the 2 Presbyterians that he hung. And there's also a great inscription on a headstone in Ballymoney which sums up the rebellion. Now, a lot of people would talk about the rebellion being a rebellion for a republic and for an independent Ireland and things like that. But it wasn't. The ordinary men who turned out wanted legislative reform. They wanted to do away with the corrupt Dublin Parliament. And of course they all became great unionists after the Act of Union, because the Act of Union gave them what the rebellion couldn't give them. It did away with the Dublin Parliament, and it gave them some rights. And the inscription on the gravestone is, "They arose in dark and evil days to right their native land." And that sums up the 1798 rebellion in Ulster.
Ladies and gentlemen, anybody any questions? Hopefully we might have a go at answering them.
Yeah, I don't know anything about the history, but I want to know, does this have anything to do with the Battle of Boyne?
Well, I suppose the only connection with the Battle of the Boyne was the family lines that had fought in the Boyne and had come through the Boyne. The Boyne was more a, well, I always refer to it, and people argue with me, but I always refer to it as basically an English Civil War fought in Ireland, with a bigger story behind it to go on into Europe.
Was it in the same period?
No, you're talking about
150 years earlier.
Yeah, it was about 120 years earlier than the.
Oh.
So you maybe had the tales and the woes and the stories of living memory, which would have been, instead of going to your iBox or looking Googling it, you know, the stories. They sat around their fires at night and you'd visit it at the weekends or in the pubs, and the stories of history would have been told and passed down from generation to generation. And that would have been, and a good example of that is, and it's referred to as, before the siege of Londonderry, and you had the Irish Rebellion of 1641, and you had what was known as the Cumber Letter, which sparked the whole mass exodus of Ulster up to Londonderry. And it was saying that they were going to the local Irish, native Irish, were going to lay siege to the Protestants or the planters at that time, as they did in the Irish Rebellion of 1641. And that was referred to as living memory because it was only sort of 50 years beforehand, and whereby the men and people that maybe had died, the older people had died, but it had been passed down from generation to generation. So we can only assume that the same stories, and that's the way it was fireside chat, and maybe like everything else, it gets a wee bit bigger, gets a wee bit smaller, and there's all bits and pieces added and taken away from it. So that is probably the only connection you have between the two, that you'll have a bit of memory passed down between the two, but they weren't really for the same cause. I would think it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same.
That was my question.
Yes,
because
yeah.
I couldn't place it.
Yeah. It wasn't the same ideas, or it wasn't the same notion behind it. It was a different notion.
Yeah, as George says, it was a lot about living memory and the memory of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers. One of the things which William had done when he came to Ireland in 1690 was to grant Regium Donum to the Presbyterians, which was a pension for Presbyterian ministers, and it was a recognition that the Presbyterian Church had rights. They were able to preach, they could have their churches. But one of the gripes that the Presbyterians had, that shortly after his death, the Anglican establishment in Ireland did away with all that. And when the penal laws came in, everybody thinks that the penal laws affected the Roman Catholics within the community. It actually affected Presbyterians worse. You couldn't be a Presbyterian minister, you couldn't be married in a Presbyterian church, you couldn't be baptized in a Presbyterian church, and you couldn't be buried as a Presbyterian. You had to be an Anglican to do all these things. So one of the hang-ups after the Williamite Revolution is the Presbyterians feel we want the rights back. which were given to us by the Glorious Revolution, and they've been taken away from us. So that's why they wanted rid of the Dublin Parliament. They wanted to be able to live as, practice their faith, be born, be married, and be buried as Presbyterians.
Okay, thank you.
That's very complicated.
A little bit more about
Yeah, a lot of people don't understand that actually Presbyterians were probably worse off than the native Irish Catholics at that time, and quite up until very recently, believe it or believe it not. And that takes us into a more modern slant on things, which unfortunately nobody knows the history of, and if we all knew it and studied it, we can maybe understand where all the gripes and the problems of the 60s and the 70s come from.
I think the mention there in terms of the Presbyterians, we talked at the very end about a meeting in Carrickfergus opposing the Act of Union in 1789, and that relates very closely to the positions that Presbyterians did welcome the Act of Union. Anglicans opposed the Act of Union. Early Orange Lodges all opposed the Act of Union because they were Anglican, and they felt they were going to be disadvantaged because it was an Anglican Parliament, effectively, it's been swept away. So you did have that very strong sense. That's why you find the Act of Union is quite divisive within the Protestant community, to use the widest sense of Protestant. There's also it is, as Andrew says, it's very complicated. The Battle of Antrim, for example, you had on one side the Presbyterians, on the other side they were defeated by the Monachan militia largely, which was largely Roman Catholic, but had some Orange Lodges within it, and they managed to defeat the Presbyterians in the streets of Antrim. So it's all quite a complicated and complex story. But all of it, as you say, a lot of it relates to this strong sense that you had a very strong Presbyterian Scottish community, and Scots are quite tightly knit as a community, and that was retained right through. Also can be quite stubborn sometimes, some Scots, not all Scots.
Thran.
Yes.
See the Dublin Parliament here. How long had that been established? Was the Dublin Parliament around at the time of the Battle of the Boyne, or?
Yeah.
There would have
It would have been
been.
followed,
Yeah, there was an Irish Privy Council the same way as there was an English Privy Council and a Scottish Privy Council. So there was still a Parliament in Scotland and a Parliament in England and a Parliament in Ireland. But with the Act of Union, first of all for Scotland, it unified the two countries, and the same with the Act of Union with Ireland, it unified that Parliament so that representatives would have to be sent to Westminster rather than have independence to do what they wanted in Ireland.
Basically just the same as it is today. You elect your representatives, and they sat and probably looked after the menial things like the boys in the hill are meant to do now, but you still had the finals, the rubber stamp still had to come from England, from the English Parliament.
So it's like a devolved Parliament then? Or a bit stronger than that?
It would have been a bit stronger than the devolved Parliament. It couldn't go to war. It had some tax levying powers, but sovereign law was retained at Westminster with the Privy Council, because the monarchy still had a lot of powers then that it doesn't have now. So a lot of rubber stamping had to be done by the Crown and by the Privy Council and things like that.
This is where the whole complication sets in. Not that we would know anything about it.
In 1574, the mayor that we had in Carrickfergus, Mr. Thomas Stevenson, was actually an MP for Carrickfergus in the Dublin Parliament in 1574.
The Parliament stretches right back to the 1100s. There's always some, since Dublin Castle was formed, there was always some connection between the two. Some more successfully and agreed than others. I think Henry VIII was about the quietest stage we ever had in Ireland. He sort of was too busy with other matters to but that was a relatively nice tipping along time in the whole of the British Isles. Although he did rack a few monasteries and things. And he fell out with them now and again over the the marital status up, tipped the balance a time or two and things like that, and did do a lot away with a lot of our old records and a lot of our old people that would have kept the records and the rolls and that. There's a lot of them destroyed at that time within the monasteries, and a lot of them went to Europe, and the boys gathered their kit up and said we've had enough and moved on. So this is why if you're looking for some records, you have to go to Italy and you have to go to Sweden and a few of these places, because the monks all dispersed. As the monks, basically they came out of Northumberland in 583, landed in Carrick here and then dispersed, and that was the time, as we know, as the saints and scholars. When I was at a funeral on Monday in an old graveyard up beside us, Carrickfergus, and it would be reckoned, it and Umgall would be reckoned to be two of the oldest consecrated burial grounds in Ireland. Being Umgall, it's known as the land of the stranger, and that's where the monks first settled, coming from Carrick, and just at the foot of Divis Mountain there. And they were sort of, because they were strangers and dressed weird and wonderfully, they were sort of pushed on down the road a bit. And if you can imagine, there was no roads or system or that. It was all high ground bog trails. You stuck to the high ground. So you imagine leaving Carrick here and going up and sticking to the high ground, dipping down in Grande, and then out round by Wolf Hill and swinging out round, and then they would head it down into Antrim. And the Umgall would have been one of the very oldest graveyards. And if you get your map out when you go home tonight and you draw, you look at Umgall on the Lyle Hill Road just out of Temple Patrick, follow it up. The Lola Road's twisty now, it was made twisty, it used to be very straight. And you follow that road down into Temple Patrick, and you have to line it a little over to get the old bridge. And if you line that up and you go up the Connor Road out of Power Gate, it's a straight road too, and that was known as the Priest Highway, that run from Umgall right to Kells and Connor, and it was known as the Priest Highway back in them days. It's as straight as a die.
There's a couple of straight roads around there, you know. Is that just because they were going line of sight, or is that because they had Romans over advising them or something like that?
No, the 7 Mile Straight, for example, was the road built for the Duke of Abercorn to go to Antrim, coming out of Belfast. Once you come out round the Horseshoe Bend, that was the road. Horseshoe Bend was made to come up, and then it runs 7 miles straight down to Antrim town itself, and to the big monastery. Was it? What do you call the big monastery? It was in Antrim. It was one of the first ones.
Macklemore?
Yeah. And then whenever Chichester come here in 1600 in the plantation years, he set about. And if you ever wondered why all the wee graveyards right in the middle of the fields, in the middle of nowhere, for some obscure reason, when Chichester arrived in the 1600s, he set about removing every chapel. There was a standard 60 by 20 chapel built on all those grave sites, and he took them right down, even took the foundation stones out of them. And you'll find them in buildings. The one that we was talking about there first is the Clady River, and the wee church was taken down, and it was used to build the bridge over the Clady River. And if you go down and look at the stonework in the Clady Bridge, you'll find some of the mouldings of the old chapel built within the bridge. And Carrickfergus, there, he put 16 cannon around it, because all the local native Irish Catholics are all run there, because it was like a tower house was built, and the local bishop was encamped there, and there was a strong wall around, so I thought it was a good strong place to take refuge. And they put 16 cannon around it, and just, he said he would not waste one spot of blood on it, and he pulverised it, and they reckon there was 11 or 12 families in it, totaling about 30 people, and he wouldn't let anybody go in and bury them or do anything with them for 10 years, and then the pressure was put on that they needed the consecrated burial ground. And there again, if you visit it, you'll see a wee round tower built in the middle of it, and a couple of crypts, and that was all built out of the stone of the original tower house. And you'll see a bit of the original wall. There's still original walls around it that's been maintained, and you'll see where the sort of bit of the tower house was built into the wall. So it's all there. And to make things a bit more squeamish, whenever the guys are digging the graves, they come across the odd cannonball, which they bring round to themselves. So I have quite a collection of them. So, but as we could talk about it from now to next week and diverse and digress, but as I'm sure you've been enjoying the last 4 weeks and 2 more to go, you're getting sort of a run through the whole thing, those that attend. Any more questions? That sounds like a plan. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We've enjoyed once again.